Okay. So I used to work on vision. This is the most famous thing I've done, even though it's not the most important thing I've done. What? Oh, slideshow mode. Okay. Anyway, so I used to share the vision chauvinism that so many people here have, and I still love vision. Vision is great, and maybe it's the greatest for all these reasons that you know. It has the best real estate in the brain. Psychophysics is the best thing in psychology. Neurophysiology of vision is the greatest thing in neuroscience. Computer vision is the greatest thing in AI, and so on. And I think those things, I still think those things are true. But then this happened, or to be more specific, that happened. This is Ruth with Robin. And I think Ruth and I both thought that when our kids were born, this would be a great opportunity to learn about visual development, and we would watch them and see the various stages of visual development, and it would be really cool, and we would read up on it. And of course, we hadn't realized that when you're a new parent, you don't have any time to read anything. And we also hadn't realized that when babies are born, their vision is really pretty bad. And, people make a living doing experiments demonstrating that babies have some vision, that they can actually do some things. But vision isn't really very good or very useful or very important initially. And as time goes on, the vision gets better, but other things also get better. And so this is an example of the sort of thing that really amazed me. This is Robin exploring a soft toy, and she is fascinated by how it feels, and she's extremely good at exploring how it feels. Then she gets interested in this chair she's in called a bumbo, and she just does this all day. She just feels things and moves them and grasps them and sees what happens. And when she's lucky, she can get it up to her mouth. The mouth has even better tactile sensitivity than the fingers. And so it's all this, that's what her life is. She's using vision, she's looking at things, but she really has this amazing capability to explore things with her fingers. And I mean, to give a sense again of the limits on her motor abilities, she's sitting in this chair, this special chair, because she doesn't know how to sit up yet. She can't even sit up, and yet she's doing this amazing stuff with her hands. And this made me just ask, well, what's important to a baby? To appreciate how important these things, tactile and sensory motor abilities are. If you just think about a baby that can't feel things and can't physically interact with things, that baby's in trouble. That baby's going to die. Whereas if you have a baby that doesn't have sight, that baby's going to survive because of the fact that it can feel things and it can move things and it can grasp things. It may not be the best way to survive, but basically the point is that touch and grasping, exploring things with your fingers, that is essential. Making physical, mechanical contact with the world is necessary to survive. You can't eat without it. You can't get around without it. So that made me get interested in other aspects of perception. And again, this touching and manipulating was very impressive, partly because I have a historical interest in material perception, and actually the two talks that we heard earlier today are just perfect introductions and motivations for the things that I was interested in as I watched my kids. Because here's an experiment I did with Sarah, my other daughter. Now Sarah, as it happened at this age, I'm not sure how old she is at this in what you'll see, but she really liked peanut butter on crackers, but she really hated touching peanut butter. She liked touching crackers and hated touching peanut butter. And so I found some crackers that look pretty similar to peanut butter. They're the same shade of brown, just to see whether Sarah would be able to solve this problem of how do you pick up this brown cracker with brown peanut butter on it? How do you pick it up without touching the peanut butter? And she could do it. She could tell the difference visually tell the difference between the peanut butter and the cracker, and she could pick it up in the right place, get it to her mouth. You can see she's doing interesting things with her hands in order to solve the problem, coming around at a weird angle, twisting it around. Now, using both hands, manages to do it pretty well. So what we're seeing here is sort of a combination of all these topics we've been talking about, right? So she's learned how to use her arms and her hand to pick things up. When she picks things up, she's feeling it. She can feel, oh yeah, that's the cracker, that's the good stuff. And before she does that, she can see it, so she can tell where to reach and where to touch. So you've got this really rich combination of skills and behaviors, all to allow Sarah to get a peanut butter cracker to her mouth without touching the peanut butter. Now here's Robin. Robin's 1 year old in this video. I know she's 1 year old because this was actually on her birthday, and it happened we were in Arezzo at ECVP at this moment. And Ruth had gone out and gotten some kind of pasta, which was a different kind of pasta than any of us had ever seen before, certainly that Robin had ever seen before. Just, it was just a ring that was a different aspect ratio and diameter and so on. So had some special name, no doubt. Anyway, so Robin then, who's just one, is confronted with the problem of eating this pasta. And very quickly she discovers a policy that will get the pasta to her mouth. And whoops, oh dear. All right, so here we go. Now, so as I said, this is a new kind of pasta she's never encountered before, and I can assure you, in case you were wondering, Ruth and I did not demonstrate to her that this was how to eat the pasta. It's something she discovered herself, and she discovered it very quickly. I wasn't paying attention at the very beginning, but she just stuck her hands there to figure out what to do, and she had enough experience. I mean, by this age, she's picked up so much stuff. The visual information and the tactile information that she's gathering is rich, and she has so much experience that she was able to figure out, oh, this is going to work. I can get it to my mouth. Yeah.
Robin wouldn't do this, right?
Robin? No, this is Robin.
Oh, which is the other one?
Sarah.
She wouldn't do it because it's too much like peanut butter. That's all.
That's probably true. So the two of them, if you gave them a feast, they would eat opposite sets of food, the slimy stuff versus the dry stuff. Anyway, so that's what babies do. They spend their lives mostly actually trying to figure out how to get stuff to their mouth, not just because they want to eat it, but mostly they don't want to eat it, they just want to touch it because their mouth has really good touch sensitivity. And at this age, I don't know, since I never got around to reading the developmental literature, I don't know what she has in the way of category abilities, but it's clear that what babies are most interested in is affordances, which, does everyone know, how many people know what affordance means? Oh, okay, almost everybody. So my definition here, I don't know the official definition. Anyway, the properties of objects that allow them to be controlled and used to accomplish some goal. Anyway, so she quickly discovered that this pieces of pasta afford, I don't have a verb for it, afford spearing, afford whatever that is. And she doesn't, need to know what they're called or anything. So we got back to MIT. I asked my friends in robotics, how do kids do this? What signals are they getting with their fingers? How would you get a robot to do this? And they said, we don't even know how to get started because nobody makes good touch sensors. Nobody makes nice soft fingers. And until that hardware exists, we can't even begin to work on this.
I think also the robotics people really don't want to get peanut butter all over.
All right, so there's a challenge. Can we make a touch sensor that is going to match or exceed the properties of human skin? You want it to be able to resolve fine details, you want it to be sensitive to small forces, and you want it to be compliant, that is soft, like a human fingertip. And there's lots and lots of people making touch sensors of various sorts. Most of them are sort of crude in terms of the spatial resolution. And most of them, many of the sort of advanced ones in the laboratory are rigid or almost rigid because they're made by, of silicon and or other MEMS techniques. So how can you make something that's soft? And in particular, how can you make something that's soft if you are me, who's not a mechanical engineer or an electronics engineer or anything, but knows something about vision? And so here's the basic idea. We're going to take a slab of clear elastomer, meaning just a chunk of rubber, paint it with some reflective paint, and push stuff against it, and then look from underneath. So here you have a chunk of that stuff with an Oreo being pressed on it, and if you look from underneath, you can see the shape of the Oreo. You can see the shape of the contact surface. The contact surface is the place where those two things are touching, and as you press the Oreo against that chunk of elastomer, the elastomer just follows the shape of the Oreo, and not surprisingly, it's getting some light on it because of the room illumination, and you can see the shape. You are using shape from shading, a classic cue to shape. And on the right is a computer vision analysis of the shape, which I'll tell you about in a second. Anyway, we call this gel sight because it's a way of using a gel to get this image. Now, in principle, you could use any 3D computer vision technique you wanted to pull out this shape information. But we use photometric stereo How many people know what photometric stereo is? Some, maybe half. So shape from shading, you may know, is a fiendishly difficult problem. I'm not even sure how well people solve it today. But light's coming at some angle, you get a shaded image. We look at it, we can figure out what the shape is. But in machine vision, it's a very under-constrained problem, and people often get bad answers. However, if you have 3 colors of light, one from this direction, one from this direction, one from this direction, the problem becomes trivial because we've got way more constraints than you need, and you can figure out the surface normal at every place because each surface normal will have a unique color. And once you have got the surface normals, you can integrate it to get the shape. And it's this classic technique, which you often will learn about in class and you'll read about in textbooks. But no one ever uses it in the real world because you're never lucky enough that you know you've got this surface that has exactly some ideal optical BRDF properties, and you've got some lights that are in just the right places for you to do it. So it's this great thing for textbooks, but useless in the real world. Except for us, since we're building our thing, we can choose to have this reflectance property and choose to put these lights here, so we can use it. And just quickly, the idea of that technique is. On the left, you see this picture. It's shaded by these 3 lights. There'll be a unique color under certain assumptions, a unique color for each surface normal. And you can build a lookup table by just smashing an array of balls against the chunk of this gel and calculating the surface normals, and you get that. From that, you get a lookup table, which is, for some reason, not showing up well on PowerPoint. But anyway, and there's some math. You integrate it, and then there you go. You can see this Oreo, shape of this Oreo. All right, so that's on a big chunk of this material. To do something for robot fingers, you want it smaller, and so this is our first small device built by Ray Lee, who was a grad student in my lab, and it's pretty simple. You've got this gel here, and you've got lights coming down and bouncing across to illuminate it from the sides, and a camera in the middle up top. And this is the first robot experiment we did with this, which was with Rob Platt. Now, I want to say that this, so I greatly appreciated working with Rob because he knows about robotics, and I don't. And in fact, this whole segment of my life and this whole talk is about me doing stuff where I'm not an expert and I'm desperately trying to learn. And so if I say things that are wrong, which I'm sure I will, please forgive me. So I'm going to tell you things about robots. I'm going to tell you things about neural nets and touch and haptics. I don't know anything about those. Anyway, so Rob he's a manipulation guy, and he said, "Oh, cool! You're getting this geometry." He's the first person who alerted us to the importance of geometry. He didn't care about force, which is what most people think about when they think about touch. He was excited because he could touch something and he could see the exact shape that was pressing against the finger. And so we set up this demo experiment where suppose you've got a USB cable and it's got that USB logo embossed on it, and you know this particular cable, you've experienced it before, so you had a chance to feel what it feels like. And so you can tell from when you squeeze against that logo and see exactly what its orientation and position is, you can figure out what the exact orientation and position of the cable is. And turns out in robotics, that's terrific, because usually they can't figure that out. This is the problem, a big problem in robotic manipulation. You're looking at a scene, there's this object, you go to pick it up, and you want to know its pose, that is its exact position and orientation, so you can do whatever you do with it correctly. But if it's a USB cable, you can't figure out its pose from vision because your finger is in the way. You can't see it. But if you've got a finger which has got a camera built into it, like this, then you can get that data. You get the geometry. You can get it exactly. And once you know that, if you know where your USB port is, and you know exactly what the pose of this is, then you can calculate that trajectory and get it in. And so here's a robot doing this. And just to show you, it picks it up at some random sloppy position because the person is just dangling it there, but it feels it, figures out exactly how to adjust its trajectory, and goes and sticks it in. And it can't see. It's just going entirely on touch and that knowledge of the world. All right, so anyway, so the gel sight, it provides this 3D shape of the contact surface. It does not provide force or pressure, and most people, including us, initially thought, well, this is a problem. You have to figure out force or pressure because that's what touch is all about. And we were kind of depressed about this because, yes, you can do this. You can do it with heuristics. That doesn't work very well. Or you can do inverse finite element analysis, which is a hairy thing to do. Because it's a hairy thing to do, we kept not getting around to doing it, and we kept putting it off, and actually we never have done it. Although Alberto Rodriguez, another professor at MIT that I'm working with, his group has done it. But for most things, actually, what you need is shape or geometric information, as I will describe. So here's a second generation. This is built by Suan Dong. It's just a better version. Everything about it's a little bit better. It's got hexagonal geometry. It's got LED arrays that are illuminating more uniformly. It gives us better answers. And here's just a demo of it holding a ruffled potato chip. You can see the ruffles. And I should mention for robots, you don't need very high resolution in your fingertips, but you can get extremely high resolution with gel sight if you want. And so just as an aside, Kimo Johnson, who was the postdoc in my lab who figured out how to build the first versions of this and figured out how to get the photometric stereo working, he decided to start a company called GelSight Inc. And the company has looked into various markets, and it turns out the best market that makes use of these capabilities is called profilometry, which means calculating the exact microsurface geometry of the microgeometry of a surface. So, for example, shown here is this handheld device. You can push it against a surface, like a coin here, and you can measure XY resolution. You can measure features that are on the order of a couple of microns and depth variation on the order of a tenth of a micron. So people in industry use this to inspect parts that they're making to make sure that they're within spec. So this is way, way higher resolution than the human finger has and higher resolution than a robot needs. but it's cool that you can do it. Anyway, so there's this, sometimes people find it puzzling to think about having these two things at the same time. Because when I tell people in robotics I'm working on a soft finger, they immediately get scared. Because, so in robotics, everything, I should say, until the world of soft robotics, which is just getting going, and until the world of learning, everything in robotics has been based on knowing exact geometry and position of everything. You know, you're in this world, you know the exact positions, joint angles of yourself and all the objects in the world. You know exactly where everything is. You pick things up, you know exactly how you're moving, you know exactly where to put it. And the idea of doing this with a soft finger is scary if you're living in that world, because you can't tell where anything is. You're going to lose resolution. It's going to wiggle. It's going to flop around. And that is true if the way you're making your soft sensor is by starting with a rigid sensor and putting a bunch of soft stuff on it. So on the left here, if you've got a capacitive array, and which is doing your pressure sensing, and you've got some object above that's pushing against it, and you've got that blue stuff, which is some gel material to make it soft, yeah, you're going to get a fuzzy picture and you'll lose information about the pose. Or in the middle, if you've got some block of resistive rubber that is, again, giving you some signal in response to pressure, you're going to lose a lot of information. But if you've got a camera-based sensor, the camera is sitting at a slight distance from where the action is, but the camera can perfectly see exactly what's happening at the surface, because the camera is looking through that gel rather than receiving some mechanically filtered signal. So you don't lose information. And I was, as I'm saying, just to reinforce this idea, people usually think touch sensing is about force. Here's a review chapter by a couple of experts in touch sensing, and the chapter is actually called Force and Tactile Sensing. People usually put these things together. But I think geometry really is what's most important. And if you think of something like you're holding a pen, what are your fingers feeling? Well, they're feeling the force, although in a sense your body already knows the force because you're exerting the force with your muscles. But you're feeling the force pushing up against your finger. But it's not really that important. If I hold it tighter or softer, the force changes, but the pen's location, its pose doesn't change. The material doesn't change. The roughness doesn't change. The shape doesn't change. There are all these things that are tied into the geometry that are independent of force. And hardness, by the way, is one of those. I'll mention that. I'll come back to that. And of course, motion, is it moving in your fingers? Is it slipping? Is it stationary? Those are geometric issues. And so understanding the geometry of this contact surface and the way that geometry is changing over time, that's very important. And this brings me to a thought on the way in which vision and touch are the same. And I should start this by saying vision and touch are totally different, because I've been through different phases of thinking about this. So first of all, if you're a vision person, a vision chauvinist, and you think about touch, you think, okay, well, I've got this retina, which has this fabulous resolution, and it can see colors, and it gets this 2D image, and I've got this brain that turns it back into a 3D image with all this stuff. And then I've got my thumb, which has got this really crude kind of touch sensing. It gets a sort of 2D image, but it's really kind of a crummy image. And the way it gets this image is by pushing against something, which is really much more awkward than just getting photons. And then what's crazy is I've got all these fingers and they're all moving and my hand is moving, and where are those things? What do they correspond to in the world? And not only is it hard to keep track of how all these are related to each other, but then I go and I pick something up and I start moving it around, so those contact surfaces that I'm analyzing are themselves moving around. And I'm going to use both hands, and I've got all this crazy stuff moving around. How can I possibly keep track of it all? So that's the first thought, that, gosh, touch is totally different than vision. Yes?
Is the use of a cane by the blind an instance of touch or sight? Is it like a shared space?
That's a good question. I wouldn't be surprised if someone in this room has a great answer and I don't. But it is a good question. I mean, there's this general thing that, going back to Helmholtz, perception is about building models of the world using whatever data you have coming in, combined with whatever prior experience you have. And so in that sense, the source of the information isn't as important as the way you're using it to make inferences about the world. And in fact, that brings us right to what I'm going to say about what makes vision and touch the same thing, or similar thing. Which there's this nice thing that Marr said about vision, David Marr. He said vision is about knowing what is where by looking. That's like a really nice compact description of what vision is. It's not everything, but for, with that many words, it's pretty good. And we can argue that touch is also about knowing what is where, except by feeling. The touch is also about building models of the world, figuring out where things are, what shape they are, and what material they're made of, and how they react when they're being touched and manipulated. So in that sense, vision and touch really are very much designed to do the same thing. And this is why it's really nice to be getting geometry out of your touch sensor, because that's, I have to be careful in saying this now that Roland just explained to us why any physically correct thing like geometry is an illusion, but it's a useful illusion. And it's a place where we hope that all the information in the world that we're gathering can come together in some sort of common representation. So if we're starting with the good information about geometry, that's a good place to start. It's important to note that touch involves both normal force and tangential force. So most touch sensors, virtually all commercial touch sensors, and even most touch sensors that are in the lab, they detect normal force. There's this pressure in this direction. There's also this stuff, the sideways force and sideways displacement, which you may not think very much about, but which is incredibly important because friction is a tangential force. Friction doesn't do anything other than act tangentially. So when you pick something up and it doesn't fall from your fingers, the reason is because there's friction between your fingers and the object, and the friction is exerting this counterforce against whatever gravitational force there is. And so you want to be able to detect these tangential forces. And our fingers can do that, and it turns out gel sight can fairly easily, and a number of other people have built sensors that can can do this. You just put some dots on this membrane. The membrane is being distorted, and if you push on it, it pushes, as you've seen with the Oreo, but also if you apply a shear, a tangential force to it, it moves, and those dots move, and so you can see the way they move. So on the top, that's somebody pushing on it with their finger. On the right is the raw data coming out of the camera with those dots. Down on the left is the height map, the geometry that's being inferred, the z-axis. And on the right is the displacement of those markers, the x and y motions. And this and a lot of the stuff I'm going to tell you was done by Wenjian Yuan. And here is Wenjian clamping an object. This is a bottle of stuff in a little gripper with a gel site on it. And as she wiggles it, you'll see these shear patterns, the tangential displacements. Yeah.
How resilient are the mechanical properties of the elastomer that you're using? Because do you have to routinely recalibrate the position of those dots, or do they just reliably always return to their original position?
Okay, so this depends on the material, and it depends also mainly on how soft it is. So there is a problem, a trade-off we have. A softer material is more sensitive. In this case, in the case of the tangential stuff, it'll move more easily. Or in the case of the normal stuff, same thing. It'll deform more easily. So you want something that's soft. But the soft materials tend to have some viscoelasticity, which means they deform, and then it takes a while for them to recover. And they also have some, unfortunately, some plasticity, meaning they deform and they never recover, and they get damaged and they fall apart. And that's worse with the soft ones. But all I can say is we can build sensors where we've traded things off well enough that it's not a big problem. Yes, Bill.
Yeah, I thought maybe you were going to also just talk about the fact that if it actually starts to slip a little bit, then you've literally got a motion cue right in your image, and all you wanted to set the pressure, you just set it till it just stops moving, right? But then you could be a little bit stiffer, and you just have a motion cue, and it slips instead. I don't know if that's...
Yes, that's true. I mean, again, the softer it is, the easier it'll be to see that cue. Well, actually, maybe that's not true. Oh, well, yes and no. But anyway, you're right. I'll actually show you a demonstration of that later. In fact, coming up. All right, slip. Things are slipping out of your fingers. This is a terrible thing for a person or a robot. Is something slips while you're trying to transport it, and here's a robot that's intentionally letting something slip from its grasp, and you can see on the right the pattern that's seen in the gel site. You've got these. You know, slip is occurring when the deformation signal, the bumps where the thing is pressing in, when that's moving at a different speed than the dots, which represent the positions of the membrane itself. And again, it's inherently a geometrical concept, and something you can measure if you've got geometrical measurements. So let's talk about something of day-to-day interest. How do you pick a ripe tomato? And that's Rosie is that her name, Rosie the Robot from the Jetsons? How many people know about Rosie the Robot? All right. When I was a child, there was this TV show about the future that had Rosie the Robot. Anyway, She was a domestic robot. Here she is trying to pick a ripe tomato. So how do you do this? You go to the store and you feel the tomatoes, right? If they're too hard, they're not ripe. If they're just soft enough, they're just ripe enough. And how do you measure hardness or softness? Well, the obvious way to do this is sort of definitionally, if you ask, well, what's the definition of a hard or soft material? The question is, how much does it deform when you press on it? And it's like a spring, right? And spring is the sort of simplest case where you apply a certain amount of force, you get a certain amount of deformation. And likewise for a solid, you can apply a certain amount of force, get a certain amount of deformation, and calculate the modulus of that material that tells you just that. And so people have done this in robotics. They get a chunk, it's got some flat surface, you've got a robot in a known place, you press on it, you measure how far it moves for a given amount of force, and you can get the answer. But what do you do when you're picking up objects? What do you do when, you've got these, what do I do with my pen? Here it is. All right, so I got this pen, it's got this rubber part on it, and I can feel that it's rubber. And I'm not in this calibrated situation where I can easily control force and position and easily measure those things. Well, this is not obvious and not intuitive, but you can tell how hard something is by feeling how your finger deforms when it's pushed against it, just your fingertip. So you can do this experiment. Put your finger on the table and have a friend come along and push on your finger, your passive finger, with a tomato, and you can feel how soft it is. It's just, you don't even have to think about it. In fact, if you think about it, you won't know, because you don't know how to think about it. It just feels soft or hard. And so what you're doing, well, I'll just show you what gel sight sees when you push a soft or hard tomato on it. That's a soft tomato. Let's watch that again. And here's a hard tomato. It's quite different. Whoops. And the difference is, well, what's happening? You've got two soft things. You've got a soft finger and you've got a soft tomato. And they're fighting it out, basically. As you press one soft thing against the other soft thing, they're having a competition to see who's going to deform more. And if the tomato is hard, it's going to make your finger deform. And it's going to keep its shape through the whole thing. Through the whole process, it's going to keep its shape. Whereas if the tomato is soft and you press it, the tomato is going to give up a little. It's going to start deforming as you press. So a single image, a single moment when you're pressing an object against your finger, you can't tell. But over the sequence you can tell, because you can see whether things are changing. And evidently, well, presumably that's what humans are doing. They're responding to this, not just a single touch image, but this sequence. And so if we only did this with tomatoes, and the tomatoes were always a given size and shape, it would always be the same. Let me just remind you again. There it is. There's the soft tomato. There's the hard tomato. But what if you had some oddly shaped things? Like what if it was an avocado, and avocados have this bumpy surface, so now you'll see this shape that you've never seen before, and you'll have the same thing going on. It'll be changing. The signal will be changing as you press, but it'll be changing in some complicated way. So how can you get this sense of hardness or softness and have it be shape invariant, have it be not just something you memorize because you know exactly what a sphere feels like? So how can you get a shape invariant hardness estimator? And we tried to solve this by being smart and using math. Because I'm sure if you're smart enough and know how to use math enough, you can figure out what that sequence should look like. But we weren't smart enough. So we use deep learning. And this is a theme in everything. That's basically what deep learning is everybody saying, we weren't smart enough to figure this out on our own. So we gave up. And we asked the computer to do it. And the computer couldn't explain to us what it's doing, but it seems to work. All right, and that's become a theme in our work. All right, so what's the problem with deep learning? Well, specifically, what's the problem with supervised learning? The problem is you need this database. And it needs to be a big database. And if you're measuring hardness, that means you have to build a physical database of objects of different hardnesses and different shapes, which is not something you want to do unless you're a graduate student trying to get her PhD. And so Wenjen did this. So she made, we got various grades of silicone rubber of different hardnesses. And cast them into a set of shapes. So let's see, she ended up with 300 objects, 30 shapes, and 10 hardnesses. That was our training set, and we mostly tested on the training set, but we also tested on these other objects that were simple but not exactly the same. And down below you see some of the pictures that you get while you're training. And intentionally we did this by hand kind of randomly because we didn't want it to memorize what things look like in a certain position with a certain amount of force. So we've got this pseudo-random different positions, different orientations, different force. And it's taking these videos of all these events and then, there's the movie. And then we stick it into a CNN and an LSTM, which to me, these are just the magic tools that my students tell me this is the standard way to do things, as Roland just said, right? So CNNs are the convolutional neural nets that do stuff on images, and LSTMs deal with time sequences. And I said the sequence is necessary for this judgment for the hardness. And so we're learning on video, basically. Okay, so does it work? Yeah, it works pretty well. On the left is shown the bottom is the ground truth, Shor 00. That's just some mechanical engineering measurement of hardness. That's the actual value, and on the y-axis is the estimated value. And again, these couldn't be memorized because every time it's a different force, different position, different orientation. So even if you're testing on the same items that you trained on, it's a different event that you're looking at. And then on the right it says if we show it some new shapes that it's never seen before, or old shapes with new hardnesses, anyway, different combinations. We also do pretty well, although not quite as well, which is sort of what you'd expect. And now here's avocados. And we just have two avocados, so when Jen feels them, decides which one's hard and which one's soft. And then she presses a sensor against it, and it gives a number, 84.6, and presses against the other one. It gives a number 56.8, and we don't know whether those are the correct Shor values because the Shor value isn't actually defined for an avocado. But what we do find is that the ordering we get, the ordering that humans give you on objects, avocados or other objects, is the same as the ordering that the machine gives you. And that's really all you can ask.
Ted,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that that industrial food standards exist for measuring the hardness of things like avocados.
They do have such standards, although they have a different scale than the Shor A scale, and we didn't have the avocado measuring instruments in our lab. All right. All right, so deep learning is coming to dominate robot touch sensing, not just in our labs, but in other labs. And there's a reason for this. Well, I guess the main reason for this is because nobody's smart enough to figure these things out. But I think one of the insights that comes from doing this hardness experiment is that it's not at all intuitive how you ought to measure hardness. Right? There's the physics, mechanical engineering way of measuring hardness, which is have a chunk of this stuff, press against it, see how much it moves with a certain amount of force. That's obvious, but that's not what you want to do when you're measuring with your fingers. What do you want to do when you're measuring with your fingers? That's not obvious, but it is something we can learn as long as we have the patience to build a ground truth database and train on it. And so we and other people have this algorithm, choose a sensor, choose a task, choose a neural net, build a ground truth database, run the experiment, get the performance, and the result is always the same. The performance is worse than you had hoped, but better than you feared, and of course, it's good enough to convince the reviewers to accept your paper, so you publish it, and then you repeat this process. And it is, it has the advantages and disadvantages that this kind of process has, which is that you get results and you can publish the results, and maybe that's all you need, but you're limited in the depth of your understanding. Okay, so here's another topic, and again, for me, since material perception is this traditional interest of mine, I'm really excited to be able to gather information through touch. And in this case, we're asking, can you use GelSight to get information about fabrics? So we got a whole bunch of clothes, I think about 100 items of clothing. And the question is, okay, what is it we want our system to be able to estimate? And we have a couple of kinds of ground truth. One is human subjective judgments. We just had people feel these things and say, this feels soft, this feels kind of stiff, this is fuzzy, this is rough, this is thick. We just gave these subjective judgments, and people agree pretty well, so we get those judgments. Categories, we gave them categories. And then we have some real ground truth, which is what does the washing label say? Does it say cool, gentle wash, or does it say, whatever? And that's nice just because, we didn't do a subjective judgment with subjects. Instead, somebody who made the clothes had a subjective judgment and put it on the label. But anyway, again, discrete classes there. And then we've got a robot. Here's a robot with some GelSight on its hand, and there's up in the left is a Kinect RGBD camera. Does everybody know what a Kinect is? How many people know what a Kinect is? All right, almost everybody. is this device that revolutionized everything, where you just buy this cheap box and it tells you not only the RGB picture, but it tells you the depth of everything it's looking at. And people in robotics use it all the time. All right, so you've got this Connect is going to guide you as to where to pick things up. And then you're going to pick things up and estimate these properties. And we just throw the clothes down, and the robot comes down and grabs it somewhere. And it turns out that grabbing it matters where you grab it. First of all, if you grab it in the wrong place, you won't even get it. But you want to grab it in a place where, just as with the hardness thing, the sequence of images that you get as you squeeze it is very informative, because you see how it changes. How much is it deforming? How is this fold getting squeezed? So those are good places. Folds that are sticking up are good places to grab it. And we actually put this. We learned how to find good places with another CNN, because we had training on this. So we have So the robot goes, it squeezes it, it makes these estimates, and then we can tell it whether it did a good job, and so we can learn what's a good place to squeeze it and what's not a good place to squeeze it. Okay, so we've got these two neural nets. One of them is learning against the ground truth database. It's learning to make these estimates. The other one is learning where to squeeze it. And then we can do the whole thing closed loop. Let me just go forward. So it also learns to tell whether it's likely to get a good answer, right? It can tell from its own experience, oh, I'm not getting good data, I better squeeze it again somewhere else. And let me just skip ahead to that video here. So here it is. It goes down, tries to squeeze it here, and it doesn't get a very good information, so it decides, let me squeeze it somewhere else. Let me try that again. Go somewhere else. Turns out that's not going to work either. That wasn't very promising data, so it goes somewhere else. And finally, it gets a good image, and it can recognize that that's a good image based on its experience, and it says, oh, I know where to put this. I'm going to put it in the machine wash cold gentle cycle bin. And hopefully it was right. Here's some performance levels with either with a single trial or allowing it to do multiple trials. On the right here, there's multiple trials, single trials. And I think what you'll agree is that these results are worse than you hoped, but better than you feared. Right? They're not perfect, but they're better than chance. So it's publishable. We don't know how. I mean, this is a hard task, and we don't know just how hard it is. So we're glad that the robot. Yeah.
So is the robot capable of moving its sensor along the fabric and it chooses to squeeze, or is that not an action that it can do? Because it seems like what I would do is run my hands along the fabric, and you have the ability to measure friction.
So we could do that. We don't do that for a couple of reasons. I mean, it can get a little bit complicated because like with the clothing will tend to slide along with it, so you have to immobilize the clothes. And then the other problem is the durability of our sensors, which is it tends to get worn down if you do a lot of this. But you're right, and we should incorporate that kind of exploration in the future. Yeah.
Just as a control, what if you train it in a real dumb way where you just always fold the fabric and give it a perfect fold to grab every time? does it perform any better than your 69% correct?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. That's a good thing
Because if that,
to find
if
out.
that-
Yeah.
if it fails on that, then there's no.
Right. That would be sort of an upper limit on what we could expect.
So, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt again, but anecdotally, I noticed that when I'm trying to work out the textile properties, then I try to grab a piece and then move the two pieces of cloth against one another, and that's the vibro-tactile component is quite a lot. And Katja Dershner and Nietzsche Dodenscholi have collected a whole lot of data of humans lying as a haptic-only condition where they are presented with random materials, including textiles, and they have to make a large number of ratings. And they make recordings of the way that people interact with those items to make those judgments. If I remember correctly, the tactiles people, when they're being asked to make the when they're being asked to make the textile judgments on textile materials, they do a lot of this.
Very interesting.
That's quite different from what I'm seeing
Yeah.
from gel side.
Okay, so right now we've got parallel gel grippers that go like this, so that's what we do.
Yeah.
When we get the robots that can do this, we're working on it. We'll get better data. But there are important cues that we're missing from gel side. We're not getting anything high frequency because we're just going up to 30 hertz with the camera, and human touch goes up to several hundred hertz, and that information is important, especially when you're doing this. And we're also not getting temperature, which is also important. So clearly we could do better with more information. All right, let me talk about associating the look and feel of fabrics. All right, on the left is a silky, lightweight kind of scarf, and on the right is a heavier wool kind of scarf, and you can tell by the way they look that they're made of different materials, and you can predict that they're going to feel different. And so when you look at something, you can predict what it'll feel like, and when you feel something, you can predict what it'll look like. Now, of course, that's not perfect, but still, you can do it surprisingly well. And this is a topic that Bei Zhao and I worked on with humans, and Bei is supposed to be here, as you know, and unfortunately isn't. But the basic experimental paradigm we had was you've got a table, and on top of it is 2 swatches of fabric, and underneath it is 2 swatches of fabric. And you feel the ones underneath, and you look at the ones on top, and you decide, you try to figure out which of the 2 goes with the other. And people are pretty good at this. And even children are good at this because we ran our kids. Anyway, the question is, can we do an experiment like this with robots? Can we show a robot a fabric and let it feel the fabric with gel site and have it figure out which is which? Now, why should this be possible? Well, it's because there are some underlying variables that are operating in both cases, which is the material and the weave and the thickness and all these mechanical, physical properties of the fabric leads to the appearance as well as the touch sensation. Now, if you just lay the fabric flat and light it in some simple way, you're going to do terrible on this. Humans will also do terrible on this. You're not getting any information about the fabric. So that's why, in this illustrative picture back here, fabric is wrapped up and tied in a knot. So the way the fabric behaves under mechanical forces is very informative. So the mechanical properties of this fabric are going to express themselves visually when we throw it over a post. And those of you who study art history or took an art history class know that one of the favorite things that artists would do at some period is called drapery, and they were proud of their ability to portray drapery, which would be the way the stuff folded and creased and flowed. It's very evocative if you're good at doing it. And if you've got a thin fabric, it's going to make lots of little folds. If you've got a stiff, heavy fabric, it's going to tend to resist folding. And you'll see some related properties in the touch image. Now, these are operating at totally different scales and of course, different modalities. So in one case, you've got the visual modality. You're looking at this fabric tossed over a post at this scale. With the gel site, you're touching it. You're looking at a tiny scale. And so in some sense, it's surprising that you could do anything. But both of those modalities are influenced by the same mechanical aspects of the stimulus. And so here's just two examples so that's a visual image of a smooth, lightweight, stretchy fabric. That's a visual image of a stiffer, heavier fabric. And they've got different tactile images. And we don't know, we don't know what tactile features are going to correspond to what visual features. And we didn't ask, we decided we're not going to ask humans to try to make some judgments by looking at these. Instead, we're just going to go straight to deep learning. And so what does that mean? All right, so we've got 118 fabrics, and we're going to throw each fabric over this post multiple times. So each of those is a random sample of this throwing process. And we're going to touch it multiple times at a different place. So each of those is a random sample of this touching process. So now we've got our database, and since we know what the fabrics are, we know whether the fabric picture came from the same thing as the fabric touch signal. And we're using RGBD images. We did some experiments where we decided just to use the depth images, because that's simpler. But in the end, since it's deep learning and you could just throw lots of data at it, we used all the data. And here's the basic idea. And those of you in deep learning will be able to say more intelligent things about this. But here's the idea. All right, we use 3 CNNs, and we ask them to come up with vectors, embedding vectors that were consistent with each other, basically that would allow them to decide whether they were looking at the same thing or not. So ideally, they could all tell you whether they were seeing the same thing as the other modalities. So that's what the training consists of, trying to optimize that, trying to find the vectors that will do that as well as possible. Anyway, the answer is, it performs better than you feared and worse than you hoped. Right, okay. The challenge is, okay, we're going to show you, I'll show you 10 examples of 10 different fabrics thrown over this post, and give you, well, I could do all the combinations, but let's see. Oh, this is the look versus feel combination. Okay. You get to feel one fabric, and then I'm going to show 10 different fabrics thrown over posts, and you have to guess which one is which one matches the one you're touching. So chance performance would be 10%. The actual performance is more like 45%. And roughly the same in both directions. So the answer is yes, you can teach a robot to touch something and predict what it looks like, or look at something and predict what it's going to feel like. Yeah.
Confused about something. So this seems like there's something kind of cool about the idea that you have these three networks and you're just training them to produce a consistent internal representation, but I don't understand how that can be enough to train them. Or maybe I missed something in the objective function. Because unless they also know that they're supposed to produce different answers for different materials, they could all just always produce zero.
Yes.
All materials, and they would always agree.
And I can't.
Where's the hidden? Is there something else that should be in there?
Let's see. Is it in the math?
Bottom line, something that I don't understand.
What you say is correct, and that's what we did. And since I didn't actually train the network myself, I'm sorry I can't give you the details, but that's exactly right. You want to do two things. One, you want to give the same vector when the fabrics are the same, and a different vector when the fabrics are different.
What's the role of y in the volume operation? I think y is a binary variable for if it's the same material or not. But like you want all
Did you
three
actually
of
work
these.
through that line and to get that understanding, or just guess? Because I don't understand.
Probably both.
I'm sorry I can't answer this question, Arrow. I know Arrow will forgive me for not being able to explain what a student did, but
So this is just a common formulation for like training these kinds of, they call them like metric learning models. So like the reason that n is there, that's supposed to be a margin for negatives usually. So it's saying like, if these vectors came from like a mismatch of this is.
And so when you train it, you have to train it on mismatch examples as well?
Yeah.
So all possible pairs of mismatch, in this case it's...
Well, it's sampling some, it's usually some expectation over it, right? So like we'll sample like these three from the same material and then the next three from different.
I mean, you wouldn't have to do that, right? You could do something like put a term in there that says that the responses are supposed to have high variance, for example.
Yeah.
all right. Well, so it's in the paper.
It's
It's just
paper notes.
yeah. All right. I think in order to leave time for questions, I think I'm going to skip over this next part. But I'll just mention it. We also did some task where we say, just can you, if I show you a picture, can you guess which of, is this the same fabric as these other pictures of fabrics? Because since it's this random process, they're not all the same. And so your ability to tell whether one of these post pictures of a fabric is the same as another one, you can train on that, since you've got ground truth on that. And then you can add in touch information during the training and then take away the touch information during the testing, and you get improved performance. That is, if you train it to recognize fabrics by these random fold patterns, if you train it and give it touch information as part of that training, it gets a better embedding than if you just train it on the vision. We think what's happening there is that probably when we're just doing the vision, there's some overfitting, and the touch prevents you from doing that overfitting. It's just extra information that forces you to use the important information. Anyway, what I think is exciting about this direction is it gets at this question of what is material perception and what's it for. Back in the early days when Roland and I were getting started in material perception, a lot of people were skeptical that there was such a thing, or if there was such a thing, that it was important. And because object recognition is such an obviously important thing. And then there's this frustration of how do you establish that you even have material perception? If it's good for something, what is it that, other than these very artificial tasks, what is it it good for? And one answer is, well, material perception, visual material perception is for the same thing that other aspects of vision are for, which is to help you predict what's going to happen when you physically interact with things. That is the goal of seeing some smooth, shiny fabric and looking at it, and Roland and I looking at it together and saying, "Ooh, that's really smooth and shiny. Don't you like that? Ooh, yeah, that one's even smoother, but not as shiny." That's not the real purpose of material perception. But being able to predict what's going to happen when you pick it up. Is it going to slip out of your fingers? Is it going to feel good when you put it on? Is it going to be warm? Predicting these interactions is presumably what it's really there for. And so if we can build these systems where we've trained it jointly to make sense out of these different modalities simultaneously, it's kind of a satisfying direction to go in making sense of material perception.
Sorry, can I interrupt one more time?
Yeah.
So this, you were showing performance of the thing when it's doing everything. So what happens if you just use just the image alone, or predicting?
So yeah, it can. I don't have the numbers on that, but yes, it can look at an example of one fabric, and then look at another picture of a possibly the same fabric and tell you whether it's the same. It can do that to some extent.
Okay, but it improves a lot by combining the cues.
Yeah. All right. Let me I'll skip past this stuff. This is what I'm skipping past. All right, and there's the speculation. Let me just say a little about moving forward on the hardware. Most of my life these days is actually devoted to trying to build hardware. And we're trying to build stuff that's more useful for robots. Here's a wedge-shaped finger it's better for picking things up because it's not this big chunky block that gets in the way of everything. Here's a round fingertip that is designed to go on the Allegro hand. That's a commercial hand that's quite dexterous, which we've just got this finger going, so hopefully we'll get some interesting results from that. All right, so I guess there's two themes here. One is about gel side. I just want to introduce you to this particular touch sensor that I've been working on. But really the important issues are about what can you get if you have rich tactile data, where by rich tactile data I mean it's got high resolution, high sensitivity. It's got all this geometric information both about normal force and displacement and tangential force and displacement. You can get lots of information. You can guide actions. You can learn things about materials. And so I'm excited about bringing this all this information together. Thanks.